For more about the struggles in Europe, I spoke to Andrew Watt, Deputy Director of Macroeconomic Policy Institute, and I asked him if there were any bright spots from today's data.
Indeed, it's a very mixed picture in Europe at the moment. You have the euro area contracting again by 0.2 percentage points. That's quarter on quarter. That's not so serious in itself, but you have to realize that 6 quarters in a row now that the euro area has been contracting. That is a very prolonged recession, and that is the real concern. On the other hand, you have Germany, as you say, growing by 0.1%. That's fairly weak, but we did have a very hard winter here in Germany. I'm not too concerned about the German figures. The main worry is really the periphery of the euro area, which is mired in recession, which is not getting out of recession, with unemployment still rising, and that's the main concern.
When we initially got into this economic crisis, if you will, everybody was watching what Germany was doing. It was all about Germany, Germany's growth. Germany was going to save the rest of Europe. So are they? And is it working out that way?
Yes and no. I mean, initially, back in 2008, 2009, Germany also took a big hit, but it was a fairly short-lived hit, and there were some sensible policies put in place to share the pain a little bit, work-sharing policies, working time reduction policies. Germany pulled out fairly quickly and fairly strongly out of the recession in 2010 and into 2011, and seemed to be pulling the euro area along. But then things went horribly wrong when austerity policies were introduced, initially in the southern European countries, but more recently also a tightening of policies in Germany, in some of the core European countries, also France, Italy, big economies, and this had negative effects also on the German economy. So the German economy's been slowing down through 2012.
This has to be tremendously frustrating for market watchers and for viewers around the world that watch this show. It's quite honestly confusing. On one hand, you have growth and you have austerity. You have the fact that we're seeing some real structural issues come about. There's still regulatory issues. But if you look at austerity versus growth, the data shows one day we get positive growth out of Europe, then the next day we get some negative growth. Who's winning between austerity and growth?
Well, I think that's actually fairly clear. I mean, if you look at the different countries in Europe, those countries that have had the most austerity, that have tightened their budgets most strongly, they're the countries also that have suffered most. I mean, don't forget, you've had quarter on quarter of reduction in output in countries like Greece and Spain and Portugal. The picture's not mixed there at all. It's a disaster, right? You have unemployment at over 25% in these countries, youth unemployment even higher. The picture's not mixed in each individual country. It's mixed across Europe as a whole.
I want to ask you about the worst case and the best case scenario. Let's start with the worst case. If the data continues to point in a negative direction, what's the worst case scenario for the end of this year?
Well, the worst case is that we have another sort of negative feedback loop from the worsening economic environment back into the banking system, more pressure on public finances, perhaps even really major social strife particularly in the southern European countries, with mass unemployment, putting a lot of pressure also on established political parties and political systems.
And the ECB has been cutting rates, trying to re-stimulate growth. Let's assume that all works out very well. What is the best case scenario in Europe?
Well, the best case scenario will take more than just the ECB cutting rates. The best case scenario is possible, but it would only happen if we, quite simply, reverse the austerity policies that have been pursued over the last years, since 2011. We get back on the recovery track that we were on 2010. Let's not forget that the European economy was growing, unemployment was falling in 2010, and the fact that we were knocked off track there is quite simply down to austerity. So if we reverse those policies, and there are some signs that countries like Spain and Italy are indeed softening their stance on austerity. If that happens, and if that's permitted by the European Central Bank, if that's permitted by the European Commission, then we will see things starting to loosen up. We will see a gradual turnaround in these economies. And then, well, nothing really dramatically positive can happen this year, I don't think, but certainly the outlook then for next year is not so bad.